Right, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Welcome back. Happy fall. Hope everybody had a restful and reinvigorating summer. Welcome back to the Tax Revision Commission. Today, at long last, we get to dig into specific proposals. And so I'm very excited. I think I'm going to begin, though, I don't know, Mr. Mayor, do you want to say anything before we start off?
We're starting with the easy lifting and moving to the heavy lifting. So.
Yep, today's a bit of a warm-up stretch. Hopefully it'll be easy lifting. Hopefully we'll get into some controversy. It'd be no fun if we didn't get to argue a little bit. But before we dig into that, I wanted to just spend a few minutes reminding us all where we've been and where we're heading in terms of the process. As you all know, for the last 12 months, we've been hearing from experts, from stakeholders, from DC residents on changes that they would recommend to the DC tax system. So we had something like a dozen expert briefings with leading national experts. We met with dozens of key stakeholders, business leaders, civic leaders, and held open public meetings. We have built a website that both provided information and also provided an opportunity for residents to submit statements and comments. And we hired a team of awesome consultants from the Urban Institute. And along with them, we have been combing through published reports, unpublished data, other sources to identify opportunities to improve the DC tax system. And we've had amazing support in all this from OCFO, the ORA, and OTR folks there. And we're not even done. We have at least one more expert briefing coming up. October 3rd, we're going to do a session on economic development. So it should be on your calendars already, with some folks from Dallas and Nashville and national experts on economic development issues. So the other thing that's been going on is starting last spring, our staff, meaning me and Mike and Becky, and our consultants have been working to distill all of this broad sweep of information, hey David, into about 80 or so concrete, actionable proposals that could potentially be part of a package of recommendations that we would deliver to the mayor and council. And our goal is to deliver that in December, which is not very far in the future. So today and for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be spending time giving you a chance to share your opinions on these specific policy proposals and have conversations about them. So the plan is that every week you're going to receive in advance 15 to 20 proposals, write-ups like the ones you received for today. For each one, probably either Richard or I will kick us off with a few words that summarize the proposal, provide some context. But then your job is to ask questions, and if you're comfortable doing so, express your opinions. In other words, to deliberate. We'll answer questions as best we can. Others, experts around the table, will provide info as best they can, and we'll take notes on how these proposals are landing with all of you. We're not going to do formal votes at this point, but get a sense of the room. So we'll use that input then to produce a package of recommendations that we'll circle back to you in November. So what all that means is that your attendance or participation is really, really important. Read the proposals in advance, come prepared to discuss them. I personally think the sessions will be best if as many of us as possible are in person. We'll do have Zoom capacity, and there's always times when people can only make it that way. But that's the goal. So maybe just a couple words about how we got to this list of proposals. We have these principles that we agreed to earlier this year. We have principles for how we're going about our work, following the data, engaging with people across the district, and working together collaboratively. So we've done our best to ensure that the proposals are rooted in the best available data and research, that they reflect in good faith the ideas that we've heard from a range of people across the district, and that we're putting together proposals that potentially we think could lay the groundwork for a consensus package of recommendations. In terms of the substance of the proposals, we tried to pay attention to our 4 core policy goals: a broader, resilient tax base for a post-COVID economy, progressivity and racial equity, economic efficiency and competitiveness, and simple and open and fair administrative processes. So all or almost all of the proposals that you're going to look at are going to aim to advance one or more of these goals. Now we know that sometimes proposals are in conflict. Like you can, that's the nature of tax policy. In addition, some of the proposals come with very significant revenue costs. And so your job is going to be to decide which proposals do the best job of achieving our goals, and then we're going to need to fit them into a fiscally responsible package that the council and mayor can agree to. So let me just touch on a couple specific aspects of the write-ups generally that I think are important to understand. So number one, for most of the proposals, we have done our best to indicate the likely impact on revenues. Where possible, we have formal fiscal estimates from the Office of Revenue Analysis, which is what does the fiscal notes for council bills. And so you'll see the delta in revenue relative to current law for the proposals. We've got revenue positive proposals, revenue negative proposals, revenue neutral proposals. And we haven't yet started to put them into packages where, you know, revenue positive proposals might offset or pay for revenue neutral proposals, or revenue negative proposals, revenue losers. That's going to come later. Right now we're focusing on individual proposals, but eventually we're going to have to make decisions about whether the package should add up to a net tax increase, for example, to cover, say, a metro shortfall, a net tax decrease, or a net neutral package relative to current law, or maybe we put forward 2 or 3 scenarios with different fiscal impacts, or some other way of presenting these recommendations. We all know there's big critical issues facing the district on the fiscal front, and we're going to have to, you know, we know we're going to need to be able to inform those fiscal issues, but we thought it made more sense to start by digging into individual proposals and then seeing how they start to add up. The other thing to know about the fiscal notes is that a lot of these proposals are scalable. So, you know, you may see a proposal saying that's really expensive. A lot of times you can do something, but maybe scale it back or scale it up. And we've tried not to present you with every single possible option, but give you a sense of what the scale of the numbers look like. The second part of the analysis I want to speak to is the racial equity analysis. You all will see that all the proposals have some words about racial equity. That's because we were specifically asked by the council to examine the racial equity implications of decisions, so we decided to really task ourselves with spending time figuring out what this might mean. And to be clear, we're not presenting to you any proposals that would treat people differently based on their race or ethnicity. We're very clear that we don't want policymakers nor tax administrators making decisions based on the color of a taxpayer's skin or where their family is from. But we know that, in fact, tax policy can have the effect of perpetuating or exacerbating long-standing racial inequities without being explicitly about race. We've had sessions talking about that. Or alternatively, tax policy can move the city forward in terms of racial equity, again, without being explicitly about race. So in our analyses, we just tried to use the best data we could find to just say, will a proposal narrow or widen existing racial and ethnic income and wealth gaps? We tried to give a little bit of historic and contemporary context where we had it and say why we think it would have that impact and draw some conclusions, even when the data is a little bit speculative. So all that said, we know that what we've provided here is it is going to be imperfect on the racial equity dimension and on many other dimensions, I'm sure. And so really encourage you to be explicit with us about places where you think the information we've provided, the arguments we've listed pro or con is overplayed or underplayed or we've missed the boat. If there's data or pieces of research that you think are essential to deciding whether you'd be supportive of a given proposal, now is the time to say so. We can't promise that we can track down the answers, but we can do our best. So the last thing I'll say is, tax policy is about how all of us as participants in a representative democracy choose to tax ourselves. It always involves trade-offs. It is always inherently political. We all hope to hold ourselves to strong moral principles, but sometimes these things are hard to measure and sometimes they're in conflict with each other. So we just look forward to spirited and honest and respectful conversation. So we've got about 2.5 hours booked for today's conversation. My suggestion would be we aim to take a bio break about halfway through the discussion. So just mathematically, that gives us sort of 10 minutes-ish to talk about each proposal. But some obviously are going to take more time, some less. But that's, and I think if we're having a good conversation, we shouldn't rush it along, and we'll sort of see where we are. So before we dive into the specifics, any questions or comments on what I've just laid out or the process?
One question. So how should we, Kate, pose our comments vis-a-vis prioritization? So there may be a proposal that we're okay with, sounds good, but relative to everything else, it's the least important. But we're not opposed to it, or we actually like it, just not as much as the others. So are you looking for us to say, you know, it's great, it's my top priority, or just right now, I like it, and then we worry about prioritization later, or what?
Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, obviously you're only looking at a snapshot of them, so it's
Right.
even hard to prioritize against what you haven't even seen yet. So I would say just give your sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Your nuanced sense of, yeah, this is just what you said. This is really important to me. I can live with this, but I don't really care about it one way or another. And we'll do our best to sort of capture that and reflect that, because we know that eventually we have to circle back around to you with the package you're excited about.
Greg, I would say, while being respectful of everyone else's time, say it all. Because we need to take in all that information that you're going to give to us. This is, you are the star of this show. We made you sit through all those presentations over the past couple of months. It's now your time to come back and give it to us. And so whatever you're feeling about it, we want it all, because it's all going to go into this process of refining these ideas and putting together a package.
Can I ask, there were 4 proposals, 4 issues that the council decided to emphasize. Racial equality was one, equity was one, but competitiveness is very much among the 4. And so I don't want us to put our thumb on the scale of any one versus the other. We were charged with 4. And I want to begin today's discussion with the headline from the Daily Mail that has dystopian DC. I mean, this is the reality that we live in right now. And so I think we would be remiss if we were not looking at these proposals through the lens of how the world is viewing us, how we are being viewed in this region, and what we need to do to construct a tax policy to get ourselves out. Thank you.
Thanks, David. All right. With that, I will turn it over to Richard, who is going to walk us through the sales and excise tax proposals.
Absolutely. As the mayor said, we're going to try start this easy, walk before we run. We're going to start with proposal sale and excise tax number 2, not number 1. Is that confusing? Yes. So we're going to start with number 2. Because number 2 is increase the general sales tax rate from 6% to 7%. Couldn't be more straightforward. And so to try and tee this up, this is a proposal within the family of the sales tax. It was put forward by PRP Real Estate Investment Management. To be clear, this was part of a package of proposals. We're breaking everything out. This is one example of that. We're just talking about that because we're going to isolate your thoughts on it. And the goals are economic efficiency and competitiveness. Currently, the district levies a general sales tax of 6% on most purchases of goods and some services. So this is the tax you pay when you buy books, when you buy clothing. In other jurisdictions, in Maryland, it's also 6%, and in Northern Virginia, it's 6%. The proposal would be to increase the rate from 6% to 7%. Why would you do this? One is the sales tax is a really effective tax. It's a simple way to collect tax revenue from economic activity. Also, it captures activity from non-DC residents. We're later going to talk about income taxes and property taxes, and there's a whole host of issues about who pays it and why they pay it. If you're in DC and you buy something, you pay the sales tax. And so one way to get more money from that would be to raise this rate either to 7, or as Nick is saying, we could possibly do it to some other. Of course, though, we would not be raising this tax just to raise this tax. There would be some other goal in mind. That can be to raise revenue, provide other types of tax cuts that we're going to talk about when we talk about income and property taxes. A way to offset that cost, or possibly as a way to dedicate revenue to WMATA and other services. Why would you not do this? First of all, sales taxes, like all consumption taxes, are regressive. That means that lower income households pay a larger share of their income in this tax. Now, we all pay the same rate, but when you're a lower income household, say maybe like $20,000, you're roughly spending every cent you earn. And so that means your tax is going to take a pretty big chunk of the money you make. If you're making $200,000, if you're making $2 million, you're saving a considerable amount of your income. And so that tax as a share of income is going to be smaller. Another reason is competitiveness. And we're in the district, we got Virginia on one side of the river, we got Maryland right to the north of us, and as I said, if we went above 6, we would be above those other rates. On racial equity, this would exacerbate racial equity. Again, this goes to the fact that this is a regressive tax. Lower income households do pay a larger share. And generally speaking, Black and Hispanics are more likely to be in lower income households and then bear a larger burden of the tax. Now again, that is analyzing this narrowly. If we were to pass this tax increase and then pass offsetting tax cuts or invest it in spending, there might be a different calculation. And specifically for this proposal, if we were to raise the rate from 6% to 7%, ORI estimates it would raise $147 million in fiscal year 2025. With that, I'll turn it over to you. Thoughts or questions?
Well, just as an opening, we know who's paying the tax? Like, for example, international people versus DMV people versus our own people?
So at my fingertips, I don't have a breakdown of it, but one of the benefits is that anyone who comes into the district, no matter where you're from or what you're doing, if you buy something that's a taxable purchase, you're paying that tax.
Well, I got that, but I'm just wondering if you told me, for example, 60% of the people who are paying it, 70% don't live in DC versus 30 who do, you know, that to me, that's the difference that makes, to me, that's the distinction that makes a difference.
We can track down an estimate for that. When I looked at it, it was smaller than I thought. The share paid by non-DC residents was smaller than I thought. And I don't know if we have it sort of DMV versus outside of the DMV, but we certainly can track down estimates for district residents versus non-residents.
The regressive nature of the tax makes this rather unattractive for me, but having said that, it might be helpful to know, are there items further items that could be excluded from the tax to make it less regressive? I think recently council added feminine hygiene products and diapers and other things, so I just wonder if that can be ameliorated with, are there other obvious things that could be non-tax that would lessen it, but otherwise the regressive nature of it, I think, is quite bothersome.
I think that this is a consumption tax makes that it's less likely to alter investment behavior, which is something that people point out. It's an economic efficiency thing. I wonder if the scoring only includes what we technically call sales tax, because there are other taxes that we have that are equivalent of the sales tax. If I remember correctly, like the tax we have on taxi cabs and Uber and things like this. So are we expanding the 7% to that broader set of services that don't always have the legal sales taxes, but actually have some sort of a tax that's emulating sales tax?
I mean, it's interesting, yeah, there's some things we've singled out where we use the same rate, but it is a specific tax, and we could think that part of a recommendation, if you raise this, you want to raise anything else that has been tied to that in the past. And Greg, your point is well noted. I know we do, the district does exempt food. It is increasingly exempting feminine hygiene products. I can't think of what other states are doing in that, but it is tough to get around what you're identifying, which is the tax is regressive, and even when we take some of those things out, the burden is still kind of flow through there. But I will note that this was also a recommendation of the 2013 Tax Revision Commission, where we had a host of progressive changes, but we included this as a revenue offset, and there is always targeted ways to do something else to help those families who are negatively affected by it.
Also on the point of capturing visitor activity, most of visitor activity is hotels and restaurants, which is not taxed at the 6% rate. So we're only capturing what they're buying from CVS, like suntan lotion or whatever. We're not really capturing the visitor activity. I mean, we're already taxing those at higher rates. I'm not saying like raise that to 11, but I think the visitor activity argument here is a little bit overplayed.
We're also at a moment where we have sort of fewer people coming
Right.
into the city district. So at least initially, this would be something that mostly district residents
Residents and businesses,
and businesses.
typically sort of a third-ish of sales tax purchases are business-to-business purchases.
The chairman hates sales tax increases. I mean, this is just, I think he would fight this tooth and nail right from the jump street. So for us to put forward solutions that we think have a serious chance of being taken seriously, I just don't see him getting on board with this, not even if it's dedicated to Mamata. Of course, that's a fight for another day. My question is, have we looked at how much leakage we can expect from such a substantial increase in the sales tax to the surrounding jurisdiction?
It's not, it's a percentage point of sales, so you would expect there to be a little bit.
It's like 15%. It's like a 15% increase in tax, something like that. Help me with my math. But it's really a matter of perception, Nick, that if all of a sudden our sales tax is 15% higher than the surrounding jurisdictions, sometimes people act irrationally. It just seems like a bigger burden than it might actually be. That percent may not seem like a lot to us, but may to them. And I'm just asking if we've done any research on it.
That's an alright question though. Knowing how they operate, I'm pretty sure that they've incorporated some linkage into this estimate.
Well, but if you don't mind, I'm just asking.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, and I think
It gets to regressivity as well as competitiveness.
and when DC lowered its sales tax rate and got it to where Virginia and Maryland was, they were very proud of that. That was a goal, and so as you said, David, policymakers that are currently in office might be hesitant to do this. On actual behavior, though, I think but yes, when you go out to buy something big like a television or another high income purchase, you might pause for a minute, especially if you're in the district and you can just some places you can walk across the street and pay it. There will be on those higher end items, and so you might have a concentrated effect on specific businesses.
Last point, just, we have a retail is on its back. We have, there's not a major commercial corridor in the city that doesn't have just rows of empty stores. This seems to me, even though they would pay the sales tax perhaps anyway, it just seems to be the wrong message to be sending businesses to starve, especially as we're trying to resuscitate retail businesses to increase these fees in this way. I mean, this is something that I would be inclined to support, but again, this is early in the process. I just wanted to put those thoughts out there.
So you would be inclined to support the increase of this?
No, I am definitely not inclined to support it. I think there will be leakage
I
to
was
the.
gonna say that sound, I didn't. Based on what you just said.
I just think where we are right now, for lots of reasons, it doesn't make sense.
Just for another argument against, to put on the record, I do think we saw the national data on poverty yesterday that things got worse for families in 2022. We'll know a little bit more about how DC was affected tomorrow, but this seems like the exact wrong time to make a policy change that would disproportionately impact low-income families.
Excellent. Anyone else? That was really good. All right, you guys got the hang of this. Okay, this is simple. Okay, moving on to the next proposal, which is number 3 for sales and excise taxes. Increase the cigarette tax from $4.50 per pack to $5.50 per pack. This is proposed by DC Tobacco Free Coalition. So currently, if you go out and you buy a pack of cigarettes into the district, you will also pay $4.50. Well, you actually pay $5.01 because in addition to the specific cigarette tax, there is basically a tax that assumes what the sales tax would be. So the consumer pays roughly $5. Also, because of a recommendation from the 2013 DC Tax Revision Commission, other forms of tobacco like chewing tobacco, dip, and vape products, we have what's called an equalized tax rate. So it's different. We tax a percentage of price for those products, but we make sure that they're the same. So we tax all products the same. Big asterisk, except for cigars. Those are something else. Why would the district do this? Smoking is harmful, and cigarette taxes prevent people from smoking. Specifically, they prevent children from smoking. Also, while $4.50, the current rate is high, it is not as high as some of our competitor cities when you look at their both state and local tax. So in Chicago, it's $7.16 per pack. In New York City, it's $5.49 per pack. And in Philadelphia, it's $4.60 per pack. Also, a cigarette tax is what we, tax nerd world, call a per unit tax. So the tax stays the same because it's per cigarette pack. So it stays the same until you change it. Unlike a sales tax, which will kind of move with inflation because it's moving with the prices. So as a result, the $4.50 per tax rate that was approved in 2018 has now the buying power. Flip this. You would need to tax $5.50 to even have the effect of the tax rate that was enacted in 2018 because the prices have changed since that was enacted. Why would you not do this? Progressive. This is just another form of consumption taxes. So it's going to take a bigger burden out of low-income households, low-income smokers, than high-income smokers. And then also the possibility that you are not, in fact, reducing smoking, but you're just pushing smokers to go to other places. Virginia has very low taxes on cigarettes, roughly $60 per pack. So if you are a smoker and you want to buy cigarettes, there is a very low non-tax option, a quick metro ride away. Racial equity, it's mixed, and this is inherent in a lot of taxes that we use for social policy, because there is a disproportionate share of black residents who smoke compared to white smokers. The tax also takes a bigger hit out of low-income households. So when you raise a tax, you're putting the burden on those low-income, largely black households. However, if the policy works and people stop smoking, you would then see the biggest benefits among those households. They would see the largest health increases as a result of the policy change. As for revenue, ORA sees this as raising roughly $100,000 per year. And this is because the rate is now high enough that it would not shoot up, because while some people would pay it, there would obviously be some people who would leave the jurisdiction to buy somewhere else. And so that's why you're not seeing a big revenue spike as a result of a dollar increase in the per pack rate. All right, that'll turn it over to you.
I actually authored the tax increase 3 times as the chairman of the health committee, including the first time in forever. And we spent the money, we dedicated the money at the time towards smoking cessation efforts directed at the very communities most impacted. If there, my 2 cents, if we are going to increase, whatever the increase would be, if it's the will of the group, would be to dedicated smoking cessation and harm reduction activities related to smoking and other. We have an opioid crisis in the city, and it is essentially being, where the government is missing in action on the federal and local level in terms of funding for these efforts. So if we are going to increase taxes in this front, I'd have the delta go towards harm reduction generally, tobacco, opioid, and other. This is an instance where the folks who are actually smoking aren't bearing the true cost of their activity. It's forced off onto a Medicaid program where we are then forced to spend on the back end. So this is essentially paying for behavior as far as I'm concerned. How it affects folks, we need to be fair in all of that, but that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, so I'm sensitive to the regressivity of the tax, but am attracted to the harm reduction effort. And I heard you say the revenue yield is $100,000 for raising the tax, which I wasn't in the original note, right? Because my question was, what is this worth? For $100,000, I'm not sure I'm not sure that juice is worth the squeeze in terms of a recommendation from us that makes any real difference to a revenue issue or a revenue gain. And I would be attracted to dedicating the revenue, but it's so paltry in the scheme of things that what do you really do with that? But if we decide to advance this, I would, as the city administrator, I hated dedicated revenues, but I think that makes sense to put that in.
Maybe we check the revenue again, because maybe we're missing a zero on
Really
this.
light, right?
Because 100,000, assumes 100,000 packs of cigarettes. That doesn't seem to be commensurate with our smoking. So maybe, is it possible between now and our next meeting that we could at least revisit the revenue?
Yeah, we can. ORA was struggling with this estimate because they are really seeing cigarette tax revenue decline a lot. And I think they were really thinking that that a lot of folks are now buying their smokes elsewhere or online. And so I think they were really scratching their heads about this one. We can push them more on.
It's just,
I know it
buy
is.
cigarettes on Amazon?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Okay, let's keep on going.
I do think, kind of, Shad, your point, there are different reasons to increase this tax. I think for years you were able to kind of do both. You were able to say, oh, we're going to help kids not smoke and we're going to get revenue. And, I remember we talked about a cigarette tax increase in 2013 and ORA was telling us, if you keep going, we're eventually going to put out our score that said it's not.
$100,000, let's keep going.
So, but I'm just saying,
Okay,
you could, like, the group that wants this is because they don't want kids to smoke.
gotcha.
And a 40-year-old will go on Amazon, but a kid might not. Anyone else like to comment on the proposal? Okay.
So if we go back and ask ORA to just sort of check the numbers, and I'd be interested in actually getting the analysis.
Absolutely.
So the ORA,
Okay. Number 4, enact an excise tax on recreational marijuana in anticipation of the federal preemption removal. Currently, the district cannot regulate and tax cannabis. Even though voters supported a ballot amendment to do that in 2014, Congress, which gets to weigh in our laws, says we can't. And until the member from Maryland's Eastern Shore is kicked out or told to do something different, we cannot. But one day, the district will have control over cannabis, and like the other 20 states that currently tax and regulate cannabis, will be able to set up a tax system. And so this proposal would essentially be, in anticipation of that, helping the district make its plans for when it has the chance to do that. This specific proposal would be to levy a 15% excise tax on the purchase price of legal cannabis sales. There's a second proposal about decoupling from a provision that has to do with taking deductions, which we've seen in a lot of states. And just to summarize that, basically because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, you can't take tax, the companies can't take tax deductions. So their business taxes are really high. Something a state can do, and a lot of states have done, is decouple from that provision to help them get it. But the bigger point is thinking about what we would want a cannabis tax to look like in the district. And so we're putting on the table a 50% tax. Why would you do this? Again, we're up to 20 states now who are selling legal cannabis and taxing it. And increasingly in these states, they use excise taxes or taxes based on the price of the purchase. Arguments against this is basically, well, one, why are we talking about this until Congress changes? Okay, but again, if we're going back to the idea of thinking ahead, there are other ways to tax cannabis. One way is to tax the weight of cannabis. This is popular first in like Colorado and Nevada. The thinking there is that if you again use it per unit, you'll have a more stable source of revenue. Generally, we've seen though that this can create complications in the cannabis market. The cannabis is a really tough business to get up and running. And the complexities behind this can have negative effects in these states, and that's why you're seeing more use just a simple percentage of price tax. Another one is potency. I've read a lot of good reports saying that potency is actually what we need to be thinking about, because that's what we're actually concerned about, is the potency of cannabis when we're talking about reducing harm. The problem is testing is really hard. We have labs that test for it, but they're not perfect. They can give you different results. And so some states like New York are trying this, but they're having some challenges. So it comes down to like, what are the goals you want to do this, and how would you want to navigate this? On racial equity, again, a cannabis tax, just like a cigarette tax, like a sales tax, is a regressive tax. And so you are taking a larger share of the burden on lower income residents who are disproportionately Black in the District of Columbia, and so you would see some negative effect of levying like a relatively high tax on this. Or I ran the numbers, and for a new 15% tax, they have 30.8 million annually with this 15% tax on recreational cannabis, which again, should come back to and say that 15% rate is in between Maryland and Virginia. Maryland's rate is 9% currently. Virginia would have a 24% rate, but they have been stuck and not actually begun their legal sales. Does anyone have questions or comments on cannabis taxes?
I know there's another proposal to talk about medical marijuana. Right now, you can self-certify for medical marijuana in DC, and there's like nobody will pay this tax because they'll all self-certify and get their drugs for tax-free. So I think I actually think this proposal is totally irrelevant. But if we were to seriously consider this, we should really think about what else has to change.
I think moreover, there's, Chairman Mendelson already has a proposal that I think is a pretty good start for what we might want to see in the district. And so I'm not sure it's worth our time to develop a proposal when he already has one on the table. And there's been a lot of advocates and others that have already debated and sort of helped shape that. So.
I would also get a read from somebody appropriate in the mayor's office about whether this would perhaps complicate or delay the congressional lifting. This is going to be rhetoric for someone to not lift it.
We don't have a proposal in here about medical marijuana, do we?
Yes.
The next one is related to medical.
Number 5.
Because this isn't,
yeah,
this isn't like federal preemption where a court could
Oh,
rule.
but that proposal, I'm sorry, Mayor.
This isn't like federal preemption where a court could rule and things would change. This really isn't preemption like I'm California and I pass law and the federal government pass another law and the federal government is supreme. No, this is, we're a creature, we don't like it, but we're basically a creature of Article 1, right? So the sentiment of Congress really is important, so we really should consider that. I'm sorry, David, go ahead, or whoever was talking.
I wasn't inclined to move this primarily because we're prohibited from doing it now. And I assume if that prohibition is lifted, then the district would move rather quickly to create a taxation scheme. But the next one is around exempting from sales tax medical marijuana. But this note in the federal preemption makes reference to the fact that medical is taxed at 6%. Why not explore increasing the tax rate for medical marijuana now? I don't support the exemption of general sales tax for medical marijuana, but I would support increasing the tax rate for medical marijuana that mirrors what we would do with this one if we could.
Well, let's use that to springboard into the next proposal, which is from the DC Cannabis Trade Association to exempt medical marijuana from general sales taxes. So currently, the district is prevented from operating a legal cannabis industry. However, it can sell medical marijuana. As Yesim has noted, because of that congressional prohibition in a way to stand up these businesses, the DC Council made it so that you can self-certify and just get your card and go to a shop. Put a pin in that, I'm gonna come back to that in 1 second. The actual proposal is to eliminate or make this exempt from sales taxes. Currently, you go in and if you buy cannabis, you pay a 6% sales tax. It's just the general sales tax, it's not a cannabis tax. The arguments for exempting it is if it's medical, then it should be treated like other non-prescription drugs that are exempt from the general sales tax. And that some other jurisdictions exempt medical marijuana from their general sales tax. Or the arguments against it, the most important one is that no other state has what DC has. No other state wants a recreational system, but can't have it. They get a recreational system. And so in states where it's exempt for medical, there's typically a recreational system with a relatively high tax on the recreational product. And I think, again, to Yesim's point, in talking about other changes that would need to happen if DC was to have a recreational system, currently there exists a tax disparity between medical and recreational, because in those states where recreational is legal, there are hurdles to the medical market. You have to go to a doctor, you have to pay a fee, you have to do all these things that would stop you from doing it. Whereas in DC, because we're in this very unique position, they have a more open system. On racial equity, it's unclear, not to mention just how odd the district's market is for this. But again, you would just have different effects on different consumers, and we don't, I think, know that much about who the consumers are in the district. And if they did this, ORA estimates that DC would lose roughly 2.8 million in tax revenue. And again, that just speaks to there is limited use of DC's medical marijuana. This is because they're not recreational, because consumers can now go across to Maryland, they can go to other states. And even with self-certification, there is just limited use of the medical organizations. So anyone have comments on this proposal?
I'd be opposed to lifting the sales tax.
I would as well.
And again, you're right, the writer prohibits us to create a recreational program. We actually went to the chairman a couple of years ago on this notion, on this loophole, by allowing people to self-certify. I think it allows folks who have what might be conventional medical issues, but also others. And, if we're gonna claim that marijuana is, is medically used for all those who are using it, I just think that, I'd say the same for Chardonnay. And it's, I'm being serious. So I just think we're not a safe harbor if we start privileging one and not the other, or I just don't think this is a helpful attention on the issue, especially because it would put Congress's attention on the loophole we have found.
I would disagree with that. I think that there's enough literature, and I'm not the marketing director for marijuana. There is a lot of research that for terminal patients, marijuana can be helpful, and it's not like drinking Chardonnay. So, I mean, I think I take it a little more seriously in terms of the use of medical marijuana.
I agree. That's why I wrote the bill. I wrote the medical marijuana bill, Mr. Mayor, and I'm very well aware of the congressional interference and why we wrote it the way we did it. And we had a very serious program, but then we opened it up to folks who can self-certify. There's a difference.
One thing I want to just raise that's not reflected in the cautions around the exemption, I think, at some point, if and when we get a recreational, sector going, then I think we can think about this. But right now, the revenue from medical cannabis taxation goes to a social equity fund that's meant to support returning citizens and folks who've been impacted by cannabis criminalization, to help them sort of move into that market and potentially open up businesses and things like that. So I think there's an impact beyond that, beyond the revenue impact that's not reflected in that write-up.
Excellent. Okay, move on to proposal number 6. Convert nonprofit sales exemptions to refunds. This is a recommendation that comes from the Office of Revenue Analysis to make things simpler and a fair administrative process. So currently, for a nonprofit organization, you qualify as a nonprofit organization in the district. You can apply for a sales tax exemption certificate that essentially will let you to make purchases without paying a sales tax because of that nonprofit designation. Because the exemption is administered at the point of sale, OTR has no way to measure how much revenue the district is losing or which specific nonprofit organizations are benefiting. The proposal, which is based in part on what North Carolina is doing, is change that exemption to a rebate. So instead of a qualified organization being able to simply not pay the tax, they would have to pay the tax and then report it to OTR and then get a rebate for what they're doing. So at the very least, we would have an understanding of what is going on. That's why an argument for change is more transparency. We'd be able to simply just track what this is doing and how much money we are doing, and that could possibly affect different policy decisions down the road. And it would also reduce compliance for vendors, if you were actually selling to them, because they would no longer have to treat them differently when they're making sales to these organizations with the exemption. The argument against it is the increased administrative cost for OTR and nonprofits. For all its faults, the exemption is really simple. Once you get it, from their perspective, there's nothing else to do. You basically are creating work for both the nonprofit and OTR in that effort to get more data and to get a better understanding of what's going on. On racial equity, it's mixed. There are barriers to Black residents entering philanthropy, but it could lead to better targeting, but we don't know exactly how this would affect low-income communities, especially those that are served by some of these nonprofits. And there is no formal revenue cost for this proposal. Anyone have comments?
Yeah, pick your battles wisely. You're about to get the ire of thousands and thousands of nonprofits who are going to complain about the burden of administering this being cash up front. And to take all that on for something that's revenue neutral seems like a waste of time and effort and grief. I'm happy to be convinced otherwise, but do all that for something that's just for transparency's sake and get to the same end, and put the burden on all these nonprofits who already say that they don't have enough money to do what we want them to do. I don't get it.
I also don't understand what the data will, no, I'm a data person, but like what do we learn from this particular exercise? Okay, we would spend money at Staples, and then what? I like the transparency, but for what purpose?
Could I ask, do we know how much has been foregone because of nonprofits not paying sales tax? Do we have any estimate? I'm just curious.
That's what you would
That's
know.
not what
I
you
can't.
know.
Or to be
appreciate
more
that we would-
exact,
don't.
how much abuse is there that you're trying to monitor to prevent?
Well, is that the intent?
No, presumably you want to monitor it so you can execute it better. And part of executing it better is preventing leakage. So how much leakage is there?
And that's what's unknown because it's happening at the cash
You know,
register.
yeah, I don't know.
Not in our offices with returns that then we have to chase down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so.
So this is on sales and purchases by nonprofits.
That's my understanding.
So if I buy a sweatshirt at the gift shop at Georgetown, my alma mater, and I don't pay sales tax on that, right?
You do.
No, you as a consumer who buys it from a nonprofit, you do.
But they don't pay any sales tax for the goods that they purchase.
Yes.
So if they buy the sweatshirts from,
Like if I'm a nonprofit and sweatshirts are integral to my organization's running, and I go out and buy a bunch of sweatshirts, those are tax-free for me because I'm a nonprofit.
but if they sell them,
They should be taxed.
if Georgetown sells them,
Those should be taxed.
I pay sales tax, but it's unclear as to
That's a
whether or
whole
not
other
they
issue.
pay sales
They
tax.
do.
Because Georgetown's not in the t-shirt business.
No, I'm just, Tony, I'm just trying
I
to
got
get
you,
an
no.
understanding of an illustration here to make sense. Which begs the question, why are nonprofits universally, without knowing their financial condition, automatically exempt from sales tax? And I get the small ones, of course, but that we have some that are.
That's not what's before us.
I understand that. I'm trying to think through this. I think we're trying to just see where folks are coming from.
I think at the end of this process, there's going to be an enormous list of burdens that we're going to want the OCFO to do, and they're probably going to say, your burden would be too much, too many more FTEs. And so out of all the things to rank that likely we would want them to do, seek more money, seek more FTEs, I got to think this would be towards the bottom.
Would the CFO care to say anything on that?
We have not developed the administrative plan to be able to say specifically both just logistically what it's going to be and also to Mayor Williams' point about will we be able to identify relatively more transactions that are occurring now that shouldn't have had, because now the person, instead of having at the register making decisions made there, they may be made under our control in the office.
I think Gregory makes a point that it's a lot of work for no squeeze. Do you see the value of this? Worth the squeeze?
Relative to a lot of things you have here, where we have to put into energy, either to restructure a tax, even increase a tax, we are not thinking this is where there's a lot of gaps in the tax code.
Right.
So, now, you can argue about the concept and whether that makes sense, whether you want to say that some people can't, some nonprofits are not nonprofit enough, that's a little different. Yeah, that's not what's here.
David, just to answer your question, the tax expenditure report from ORA says that what they call semi-public institutions, basically C3s, that's about roughly $50 million a year.
1.5?
In lost, 5-0.
That's it.
In lost revenue.
And C4s is about roughly $150 million in lost revenue as a result of the
It's a
sales
big
tax
amount.
exemption.
This is just sales taxes or?
Just sales taxes.
Look, I didn't mean to change the proposal. I'm just curious as to, if we're
No.
going to kick the tires and reconfirm certain commitments to tax policy, I don't think we should be afraid to ask the question.
No, I agree, and I would say that's a good example of how I think when we're talking about one proposal, that might give rise to a somewhat different proposal, and that's not outside the bounds here. We're not, if a conversation, Rashad a few minutes ago said, well, actually, maybe we should increase the tax, and honestly, that wasn't on our plate, but we can put new ideas
Well, what
on
about
our
changing
plate.
convert to eliminate? Is that where we're going?
Yeah, we could get some money.
Yeah, I mean, $200 million?
Oh, eliminate the exemption?
I had to remind you, Nick, that the tax expenditure report methodology, there's always their fine print saying never use this for revenue estimation purposes or scoring purposes.
Fair enough.
So if ORA is not giving you an estimate,
Yeah. That's one of the
But the
reasons.
200, but to be clear, the $200 million is the whole universe, or it's what they believe is abused?
No, that's the whole universe. That's all the tax exemptions for purchases
really
by
help me,
C3s and C4s.
That doesn't really help me, because I want to know how much of it is abused. If you said $50 million of it was abused, then you match that against the burden you're placing on the nonprofits, and you might say, net costs, that's worth getting this, benefit, but if we don't really know, we still don't know.
and also the number of nonprofits that have this certificate is far less the number of nonprofits in DC. Most times you don't really ask for DC nonprofit status if you don't have property, a lot of us who run nonprofits don't even have this. So,
If I'm a nonprofit and I need to go buy toothpaste for my people I'm serving, and I arrive at CVS, do I have a piece of paper that I get out of the tax?
Yes.
Certificate.
Okay.
And don't forget, churches fall into this category.
that's right. And they have property too, so they
Yes.
have the reason
Right.
to apply for DC nonprofit status.
Okay, well, we think there's not really support for this.
Number 7, exempt labor surcharges from the restaurant tax or reduce the restaurant tax rate. So in November 2022, DC voters chose to, over a course of years, eliminate what's called tipped minimum wage. That is previously the district had a minimum wage, and it had a minimum wage for people who got tips. And the tipped minimum wage was significantly lower because the rules were they were supposed to get that money in tips. With that going away, and as that transition is going on, you're increasingly seeing restaurants put service fees on their tabs. That basically the person going to the restaurant, who goes to the restaurant, they can still tip, but their bill is increased because there's a service fee to account for, at least in part, some of the higher wages that are being paid to these workers whose minimum wage is increasing. This has a tax angle because if you went to a restaurant and you got your tab, and it was $100, you then paid this restaurant tax on the $100 and you could tip, and there was no tax effect on you, the consumer, when that happens. You go to the same restaurant, you pay $100, there's now a $20 service fee included, you now pay tax on the $120 because the service fee gets lumped into that. This proposal would allow them to put this service fee of up to 18% on the restaurant bill and exempt it from the restaurant tax. Alternatively, you could just propose to lower the overall restaurant tax from 10% to 8.5% to lower the amount that's being placed on its bills. The arguments for this is that this would in a way go back to a similar system that existed before, where the portion of what you, the consumer, is spending that is going ostensibly to the workers is not affected by the tax and increasing the amount that you're paying when you go to the restaurant. The arguments against it is, one, not every restaurant levies service fees. I mean, you can think of restaurant to restaurant, or you just think especially like the bigger ones, like McDonald's doesn't have a service fee, but they're still having to incorporate this into their orders. There are also other organizations other than restaurants that have tip workers. So people at nail salons, people who work at parking garages, they are also being affected by these changes in the minimum wage laws, but they would not be getting this kind of workaround that you would be providing to the restaurants. And then there is nothing that says service fees, go directly to the employees the way that your tips directly went to the employees. On racial equity, again, it's uncertain. It's very hard to decipher the benefits and the costs and who's paying. And then on revenue, ORA estimates that, let me make sure I get this right, if you exempted it fully, it would cost about $13 million in 2025 and then increase over time to as much as $26 million in 2029. And if you reduce the rate, you would see a revenue loss somewhere in the ballpark of $75 to $85 million annually.
If there's a choice, I would choose B instead of A. Personally, I don't know, the chief financial officer is responsible for administering this, but I just think there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of opportunity to game the system. I mean, I think a lot of folks would be inclined to want a similar, anytime there's a regulatory thing that hits an industry, they might try to have a similar fee of some sort. I think it's worth exploring the reduction in the rate, but I wouldn't favor the A proposal.
To follow up on David's point, so my first question is this already in the estimates? Like the change is very recent. Do our revenue estimate projections are already including the additional tax from this surcharge now that's being taxed? So obviously the base is larger. Was that base increase projected in the revenue estimates? The second question I have is why 8.5% if proposal A costs, what was it, $40 million? Why can't we reduce the sales tax so that the cost is $40 million? So does that make sense?
Yeah, there's no reason you can't.
It's already, yes, it's already in the base. I mean, this is based on the latest projections of sales tax revenue, so it's relative to the base. And you could. I mean, the reduction to 8.5% was intended to mirror for any given restaurant what's the equivalent savings versus an 18% service charge that's exempt.
But clearly they're not the
But
same.
they're assuming ORA is assuming only 25% of restaurants will go this route, will choose to go this route, even if that service charge is exempt. So the cost is one quarter. So the cost of the exempted service fee is 1/4 of that rate cut that benefits all restaurants.
So we have this tipped wage requirement right now, which the unintended consequence was these service charges, which was like an expansion of the tax base in ways that maybe the legislation did not intend. Who knows? But let's say it did not intend. The idea here is to hold restaurants harmless. So they're not paying taxes on these service charges, which are arguably going to the workers, assuming that they're going to the workers. Maybe they're not. I don't know.
Questionable, yeah.
I would be interested in the tax rate that's like exactly equalizes.
Yeah, it's really close to 8.5%. 8.43 or something. It's just 10% minus.
How could it be,
18%.
Nick, if proposal A is $14 million in fiscal impact and proposal B is, what, 70 million? Maybe I'm not reading this correctly.
It's because they don't all have the service fee yet.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. Makes sense.
Do we know what types of restaurants are the ones instituting the service charge generally? Are they expense account lobbyist places? Are they neighborhood places? Like, what's the nature of the restaurants? Are we hitting people, lobbyists who are dropping $200 martini lunches, or are we hitting people going out for a snack? Or and I guess one of these things of out of all the tax relief that we can provide, I mean, I'd love to lower everybody's taxes, but out of all the tax relief that we can provide to people, this does not seem to come to anywhere near the top of something that businesses and competitiveness, especially since so much of it is borne by visitors, conventioneers, tourists, unless it is neighborhood eateries. But I don't think typically that is the kind of places that are. But I see it came from busboys and poets, so
That's,
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
that's,
it didn't.
that's a mistake.
It
Sorry.
came from the chamber.
Yeah, it's a chamber.
You know,
Association.
Andy
Oh.
Shalal raised, I think when we were discussing it, he raised the fact that when, one of the reasons restaurants may not want to work the service charge just into their prices, like just raise prices, 'cause that's like basically what you're doing, is because it, and the reason they want an exemption in part is because it keeps it from being an increase in their income, which can increase their rent in some cases, which I didn't know about. I mean, he made that comment in our session. I feel like that's an issue that could be dealt with separately. It doesn't have to be a tax policy conversation. It could be a conversation about, you know, how rents and leases work in the district. But he did not bring that. Raj with Provoke was against it, and I don't think the person from this District Bridges said anything about it. To my
No, she
recollection.
I don't
So-
support this. I think there are a lot of reasons that restaurants need help covering their costs. Tip minimum wage is one of them. Food prices might be the other. Least expense may be a third. So there's all kinds of reasons that I think a restaurant would decide to institute this tax or this service fee, and not all of them are instituting the service fee across all restaurants. And so if a restaurant needs to, from a business perspective, raise its price, then it has to raise its price. If there are reasons that they would rather not raise it in the cost of the thing there, so the service they're providing, the food, I get that, but that doesn't mean we ought to come back and then reduce either the meals tax rate or eliminate this from taxation. So I don't support A or B in this proposal.
I'm in the same place. I
same
would
place.
also just add, I mean, I just thought this was a good analogy that I heard Ed Lazier make, which is, you know, when we had the prevailing wage increase to $15 an hour, you didn't like walk into a hardware store, go buy a hammer that says, oh, it's $10.99, and then get to the counter and they said, but we're gonna add 20%, you know, and then you're paying a much higher price. Like, you see the price for what it is right there on the counter. So anyway, like just the whole idea of the service charge, I think, is kind of controversial.
And I think there's an optionality in some places, if you ask for them to remove it, they will.
Yeah, I forget that.
Just to final, I appreciate what you're saying. I do think that the restaurants are in need of some relief. This referendum did not affect all businesses equally. It was a change in their business model through the referendum that we have seen. Folks don't see the impact on our restaurant industry right now with the closing of our restaurants right and left. And I mean, Helen Keller can see the impact of this tax on our businesses. And I think it makes sense for us to make a gesture, albeit small, to the restaurants that we hear that they have been forced to endure increased prices, that this is a decision that the city made. And part of what we can do, the least we can do, is help reduce some of those burdens. I'm very much in the camp of B, maybe not 8.5%, but some gesture in this day and age seems to me important as we are losing restaurants.
Restaurants, I mean, to David's point about a gesture, you know, I monitored this closely. The restaurants were hammered by COVID, I mean, hammered by COVID. And now you've got telecommuting patterns and the federal government, you know, lack of presence of the federal government. Restaurants are hurting, and I think, you know, we, as a matter of public policy, support a number of businesses that we think add to livability in the city and attractiveness of the city. And all of these proposals have rough edges and they're inexact. But I think that this is worthy of examination. I'm not saying we should adopt it today, we're not adopting any of them, but I think it's a serious proposal.
I would be totally against A, but I would have some consideration for B.
So we are just about at the halfway mark through our time. Should we take just a 10-minute break? Back here at, yeah, it's now 4:42 at 4:52.
There's a little cafe on the first floor.
Cafe on the first floor, restaurants, or men's room is that way, women's room is that way.
No.
Right?
Good thing.
with the plan for?
All right, it is 4:53. We're going to start back up with SE8.
We have 3 sales tax ones to go, and then we're going to kick over to Nick for some fines and fees and a few other things. So sales and excise tax 8 is to end the sales tax exemption for valet parking. This is proposed by ITEP toward a broader, more resilient tax. Currently, valet parkings are exempt from the general sales tax. It's most likely a function of a lot of things are exempt from the sales tax that are not goods. Because when sales taxes were created, people bought stuff as evolution, the economy evolved, people bought services, you have to add them to the sales tax base. One of those things is valet parking. So this proposal would make it eligible, and you could then levy either the current 6% general sales tax rate, or you can go a step further and levy the 18% tax rate that is levied on parking in commercial parking lots. The argument for it is that other forms of parking are taxed, so why is valet not taxed? The argument against it is specific because it harms valet parking. It would increase the price of valet parking and therefore harm those businesses. We have a small but positive bet on racial equity because most of your valet parkers are relatively high income, relatively white households. Revenue from it, our estimates, it would be $90,000 if you levied the 6% rate, and closer to $300,000 if you levied the 18% parking rate. Any thoughts and comments on this?
So in other words, you'd be raising citywide $300,000 more dollars?
Yeah. On the one hand, I doubt that valet parking is elastic at all. But having said that, picking your battles for this amount of money.
It's not even, yeah.
Exactly. As a message you're sending is you're, because what we will hear is we're showing high earners that we need in the city to spend away, even if you're not, and why go through it?
I feel like you're nickel
We got $300,000. If you were a city administrator, and I come to you, I got
I would
$300,000.
say, please stop talking about this. That's what I would say, Mayor.
I agree.
And I would never take it to the mayor.
But if this is an issue of principle, why isn't this broader? Like, where is the yoga tax?
That's a good question. Would you like us to come back with a broader range of possible services? I would say that.
I would be interested in understanding how much room left there is. So there's at least some sort of principle there, right? Like we're broadening the base. You cannot even think about reducing the rate. But it kind of runs into what we learned, as David was saying, some of these things are politically so difficult, like why are we even wasting time? Yoga tax is one example. That's one thing that got picked out of the package.
The 2013 Commission did a great job of, and a politically difficult job of, identifying a bunch of consumer services that most economists will say you ought to be part of the tax base, but are politically challenging. I don't know the history of why valet parking didn't make it onto that list. This would be arguably cleaning up a loose end, but I agree with you. Singling this out, makes sense. But we can do another scan and see if there's a broader range of services, but this was the only one we found so far.
And then there's at least a principle attached to it, as opposed to.
Yeah.
By comparison, do you know how much the so-called yoga tax raised last time when the council raised that? Like, is that just by comparison's sake on gym membership?
Remember that.
So the 2013 Commission recommended expanding the sales tax to a collection of services, which gym was one. I remember that collection brought in roughly 20. I don't know if there was ever an itemized list as to what they would do, and then once it's taxed, you don't keep a record of the itemized list. But the benefit, and to Yessim's point, the benefit of the 2013 recommendations was there was a list of like 8, and it was we were doing it to broad services to broaden the base, and so and of course brought more revenue too.
I mean, if there were a grouping of these that made sense to do, that'd be different, but for $300,000, it's just not. It might cost them more to administer this.
May I suggest that states that don't have income tax but sales tax probably has principles or concepts that are broad sweeps of the economy, because they have more pressure to raise money through the sales tax. Just an idea. So we're going to spend time in that. I think there's, on this issue, I think there's some examples there. There's not too many of those states, but a couple.
The ninth proposal is to eliminate the electric vehicle excise tax exemption. This is another broader tax base. So currently, actually, electric vehicles are exempt from the 6% sales tax as a part of the district trying to shift the tax burden onto heavier cars that therefore have a greater environmental impact because they require more gas. The proposed change is to eliminate that exemption, and therefore all vehicles would be taxed at minimum at that 6% rate. The arguments for change is that this is horizontal equity. You're buying a car, you're still buying a car, and everyone should pay the rate. Some of this money goes towards infrastructure, and while electronic vehicles obviously have big environmental benefits, they still cause wear and tear on the roads, and so you would want to collect revenue from them to assist with that. And that as we shift toward more electronic vehicles, there will be a need to make sure that that tax is broad in collecting money from all of these types of vehicles. The arguments against it kind of go back to why it was done in the first place, which is there is just a different cost of electronic vehicles versus cars that consume more gas and have a larger negative environmental impact. On racial equity, this is again very uncertain because there are just numbers of indicators that would go into trying to analyze the effects this would have on a broad population. If you removed the equity exemption for electronic cars, ORA estimates it would raise roughly $20 million per year.
We could use it.
I said, Tony, I promise this is the last time I'll say this, but I authored the bill that gave the exemption to electronic cars. It was 20 plus years ago when Honda first came out with its electric car. And the notion behind it was very simple. These were experimental devices. We wanted to encourage the electric industry and alternative fuel vehicles. And at the time, they were very, very expensive relative to traditional diesel. The idea at the time was to incentivize and create more parity. And we were among the first to do it. And I think it was 2000. The market has matured, the prices have come down, the reasons for the tax abatement, in my mind, have evaporated. And so I would support this.
All kinds of
I second.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. I mean, at a very least, putting a flat fee on it so you're not giving undue benefit to what's the $150,000 one? The Rivian, whatever it is. Yeah, like, why are we doing that? And eventually, if
Is this something that we're happy with as the Tax Revision Commission? Like, are we missing some magic numbers? I don't know. That to me is the more interesting question than should we exempt them. It's more like our base is going to change and the tax rate doesn't really capture that.
Okay, I'm now going to jump all the way back to the first proposal for sales and excise taxes. And this is strengthen and clarify taxation of digital ads and services, proposed by Darian Chansky of the University of California, Davis School of Law. This is last because this is a
quick question. Did he present to us? Is that
yes. So this last it's basically creating a digital ad tax in the District of Columbia. First one. Sorry, I moved to the end because this is the most complicated, so bear with me. I might trip over a few things here.
Okay, let's
But
go back to the section.
the general idea behind this is that when you go to the store, you buy something, and so you pay a tax on it. The store makes money because you go in there and you buy something. That is not how online platforms like Facebook and Google work. How they work is they take your data. The data is the purchase. And so you would want to create a tax on these organizations that are collecting data, because that is essentially the transaction of this new economy, is that you're no longer going in and putting down money and paying for a service. You're firing up your phone, paying for a service, and they're taking your data. And that has economic activity, and therefore some part of the district's tax system should capture it. The proposal that is here is related to a similar proposal that was enacted by the state of Maryland, where there is a tax on these organizations that basically they have to be a certain size and they have to have a certain amount of activity within the state. And so it would have to be a certain size of an organization, again, the Googles of the world, and they would have to be operating in the district and collecting enough money from the district. Big caveat, that Maryland law is in the courts. It is being fought tooth and nail by these organizations that very much do not like this, and so that is a huge complication, and that if the district were to enact this law, they would join them in the courts and in the process of them figuring out these laws. The arguments for it is basically this is keeping your tax code up with the economy. Like 10, 20 years ago, people like me gave these talks and they were like, we used to buy things and now we buy services, so we have to broaden our sales tax base because we're buying a bunch of services. And this is the kind of the new vanguard of it. We're like, we're not even buying stuff anymore. We are just having these organizations, these very large multinational organizations, collect data from us, and that's how they make their money. And so you're going to have to try and find a way to collect revenue from it. Another is that it is seen as a way of getting revenue without having a centralized direct effect, because this is not directly a tax on DC businesses. It is on international businesses that are operating in the district and operating across the country.
So how analogous is internet sales tax? Oh, when we talked about it in 2013, how analogous is just now seems quaint. Oh, like I buy something from Amazon, old style buy it. Is this, I'm still buying it with my data, right?
No, not at all analogous. So imagine Washington Post has digital space for which you can interview, right? Advertise, I'm sorry. So there is a seller of that advertisement that's selling the real estate in the Washington Post digital space, and there's the buyers, whoever wants to advertise their services. Maybe it's a DC company advertising HVAC services, maybe it's somewhere in Virginia doing, or maybe it's Zappos trying to sell shoes. So what I would really like to understand is, what is it that how do you measure, so Google owns one of these exchanges, all of these digital advertising stuff takes place on exchanges. It's like somebody sells a space, somebody buys a space, and the revenue generators are those that are really matching the user data to the demand. My question is, how does Maryland count what is Maryland-related revenue?
That is a good question. I think the most important thing, yes, is that it's something I left out, which is that like the second part of this, which they take the data and then they sell ads. So like I use Google every day. I never pay a nickel to Google to use it, but they know what I search, and so they send me advertisements, so they make money. And
Right, so you're buying it by conceding your privacy. That
Exactly.
amount of concession of your privacy is your purchase.
Yes.
In this
exactly.
case, the privacy is free.
So it is like the old tax. You just have to figure out who did what, when, where, and all that, right? Yeah.
Well, it's not their purchase, it's their sale. It's Google's sale and his,
Right.
Google's
That's
purchase
where
and
it
his
is
sale.
different, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I believe it has to do with just the company's revenue. So if the companies are generating revenue, so basically first of all, there's like how much revenue they have total. And if you're above that, you're eligible. And then it's like how much do you have in the district? And so the way Maryland does it is like you're saying, like if you are selling ads to people in Maryland for like Orioles and Ravens tickets. Like, there's got to be a way that they have knowledge of that, or some way of understanding that they are getting a portion of their revenue from transactions. And I apologize.
That's
I'm
not
not.
my understanding. You're not selling ads to individuals. You're selling ads to companies on valuable real estate, and the value of that real estate is the people who visit that website,
You're
right?
selling the ad based on the data about who's looking at the page.
Right, exactly.
But ORA has a revenue estimate here, so what do they make it based on?
They couldn't do it, fixed it.
I think they based it, basically, they prorated the Maryland, they looked at the Maryland estimate and piggybacked off of that. But I think at a sort of conceptual level, it is sort of basically an eyeball tax. And the alternative version that's part of, that we mentioned here is something that the state of New York has picked around, they haven't enacted yet, is a much more straight sort of flat fee per user. So it's,
I would be interested in exploring this, but the lawsuit in Maryland gives me pause. I cannot see how DC could pass legislation enacting this, knowing it's gonna be sued and challenged, and that's gonna take however long it's gonna take.
Well, a couple of questions. So I'm wondering, does the excise tax get around whatever the issues are in the lawsuit? Like, does that change?
advocates of that tax believe it does, yeah.
And then,
But it hasn't been enacted, so it hasn't been challenged yet.
and we don't have a revenue estimate though of what an excise tax is bringing, just.
It's a big number, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, it can be scaled. I mean, it's, you know, you pick a number and you tax people.
How do you think the excise tax addresses the challenge?
I don't know, that was a question, is like
Oh,
whether it
okay.
does or not, because that, if that's a way around that issue, then maybe it's more worth exploring.
Yeah, there's, as you can imagine, there's a lot has been written on this, and there's a lot of jousting
We
going on.
definitely need to get an estimate.
And could you get legal sufficiency on a bill?
It's also where Eric is right that this is.
And I can say one other thing. Unlike marijuana, and I would please disagree, in this, I don't see the Congress automatically nullifying this because there's a lot of agreement in the Congress on both sides of the aisle that the tech companies ought to pay more freight.
I think Rashad's point about whether or not you could count it as revenue, knowing all this is coming, is a good one. But I think what Richard said earlier is something I definitely associate with, which is I don't relish raising taxes on anybody, but broadening the tax base
Right,
to
that's what
reflect
we're
the
doing.
new kind of economy we have, catching stuff
That's
that
what you-
heretofore we didn't need to catch because it didn't exist.
Absolutely.
Is what we should be doing. And so I look at this as modernizing the tax code and just reflecting the nature of a changing economy. So I don't look at it as a tax increase at all. And broadening the base, making it more fair. And, this is kind of money that we can provide in relief to other businesses. So I think depending on whatever happens with the lawsuit, it kind of makes sense to do something like this.
Well stated.
I just think that it has high implementation problems, so I would be, I have no objection to creating this tax, but I would be worried about saying, oh, it's $48 million, let's trust this is the case. I think we need more experience.
You may not book it, but
The CFO would discount it by 90%.
but the ratio of cost benefit is definitely higher than it was for the
Yeah.
valet parking.
Totally, totally. And it's we're taxing some corporate income that has nothing to do with our economic activity. So sure, go for it.
I don't know, I think
Implementation
it'd
is
be a
my
high
only-
number,
my
because you
only
have a lot
concern.
of high net worth in DC.
Yep.
My concern is just implementation. I would support this, it's just implementation. And so how you would go about collecting the data to properly price it, where, we may not have the expertise legislatively to know what we are asking of these
I
companies.
think the mayor and the council really need to lean in and really do the research.
To do it in a way that doesn't interfere with innovation, but also gives us
Absolutely.
an amount. That is my only concern, that we would get it wrong. But we're taking on the owner of the Washington Post, Amazon.
Yes.
Google,
Yes.
Facebook. So we're taking on, 3 of the 10 largest companies in the world. We shouldn't underestimate that.
They'll sue us.
Sorry?
They will sue us.
Well, it's not that they will sue us, it's just, reputational, the messages we're sending and all of that stuff. But I think if we can make an airtight case for a reasonable ability to estimate and collect that is not unduly burdensome on their ability to operate or their business innovation, it becomes a harder fight against us. But I think there's a fortune to be made in data mining, and frankly, I would extend this to pharmacy benefit managers and the data mining they engage in. No, seriously, like everyone is talking about pharmacy benefit management. We were doing this 20 years ago, getting sued in the DC circuit by making them fiduciaries of the insurance companies, which they should always have had a duty of loyalty and care, but that's another story. There's huge money in data. The focus is on how do you collect it in a way you can verify it without causing unintended consequences.
But I think if we don't ever put it on the table and start looking at how you administer it, how you collect the data, then it never happens. So we need to have a starting point. And I agree with Gregory. It's time for us to look at taxes via the environment that we're currently living in. Yeah.
I would like to frame this in that there's so much uncertainty in understanding precisely what the market is to be able to write language to levy a tax, that this will take a while to understand.
Yes.
But first and foremost, we need to see what happens in Maryland. If it makes it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, what do they have to say about it? There's constitutional issues that they're challenging as well as the straightforward law issues. So anything is possible. This just will take time to really understand. So.
Corporations have First Amendment rights except when they're fighting for ESG, then they don't. Okay. That was the editorial one. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to walk us through our last 5 proposals.
That's on the last page there. It was in the front.
First page of this.
So we're going to start with the fees and fines, the 3 fees and fines proposals that we're talking together. Fees and fines numbers 3, 4, and 5, confusingly. Numbers 1 and 2 will come to you at a later date. And I'm going to talk about these together because they broke them out for mostly for revenue estimating purposes, but they really are related to each other. We heard presentation, and we've also gotten testimony that just shows how high DC's traffic fines and the related late fees are relative to other jurisdictions. And this is true both in absolute dollar numbers. If you speed in Montgomery County, you pay $40, period. If you speed in DC and caught by a camera, it's $100, it's $200, it's $300, it's $400. So our dollar amount of fines, or traffic fines, are high, and we have the phenomenon of doubling the fines after 30 days, and then after 90 days, another 20% fine on collections. Really puts this up, makes these numbers go very high in a way that is very burdensome to particularly lower income families. That's the argument. And so we've had a number of folks say, hey, can we do something about the traffic fines? The challenge, of course, is that these are raising a lot of revenue for the district. In addition, arguably, these fines are part of the justice system, right? So they are intended to be serving as a deterrent, and they are intended to be imposing essentially a form of justice. If you do something wrong, you should make recompense to society. So the proposals on the table are to reduce the fine amounts, to reform the late fees, and to deal with what happens when people continue not to pay them and it gets turned over to the central collections unit. There's a few ways you could go about this. You could decrease the traffic fine amounts across the board, just cut them all by 50%. I'm not saying that there's probably a lot of other more nuanced ways you could do it, but as a way of starting the conversation, you could just knock them down. Most people who get caught by a camera in DC are paying $100 fine, so you knock that down And the revenue impact of that would be about, that would cost the district about $200 million a year. If you went a step further and reduced it by an additional 50% for lower income families, those who qualify for Medicaid or SNAP or TANF, their lost revenue would be another $20 million. So the other way to think about it is you would be saving those families that.
Can I,
Yeah, go ahead.
is that cumulative, like the 50%?
No, those are on top of each other.
Okay.
If you just did the reducing it, if you kept the fines where they are and just reduced it, then it would be $40 million.
Gotcha.
You know, an argument for a change is regional competitiveness, be more similar to how we are to our neighbors. Virginia and Maryland have lower fines. And there's also an argument that this is not a particularly great way to improve street safety. The research seems to suggest that while it is effective to send people a note in the mail saying you've been speeding and you got to pay, it doesn't become more effective if the dollar amount goes higher. What it does tend to do is tend to make people be like, oh, I just can't afford that.
Yeah, so the research shows actually that it hasn't, you haven't seen whatever metric you want to use, fewer fatalities, accidents, fines going up?
Right.
Really?
Yeah. The higher fines seem not to. Now, I won't, you know, there are probably individuals for whom that does help, for who might change their behavior. But you sort of look statistically, generally, it does not have much of an effect. And there's more.
Well, David was around. I mean, we put this in originally because you had mothers saying their little kids were getting hit by cars screaming down the street, right? So you put in these fines to slow the cars down. But what you're saying is over the years now, you're not seeing any more, it's kind of like flattened out.
I think it's the absence of enforcement there. You know, I mean, we can fine you, but we don't necessarily collect whether we ask you for $20 or $100. So I don't, personally, I think it's an absence of enforcement no matter what the fine is, and people quickly understand there's no enforcement no matter what the fine is, and they make conduct accordingly. That's just would be my 2 cents. I would just, if
And
this
it's
one
not
line-
all our fault, right? Because we don't have reciprocity. It's not all DC's fault. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I would be open to the next issue about, you know, the doubling issue. That seems, you know, because that seems fair. I also am not opposed absolutely to the idea of there being a hardship exemption if it is made. What I really very much oppose is creating 2 tiers of populations. One, you know, what are we are defining all low-income families as SNAP beneficiaries. You know, I just am not a fan of segregating populations and having different penalties apply. I think it sends a bad message. I mean, not to equate them, but we essentially decriminalized activity among juveniles over the last year and a half, and we're all suffering with the consequences. We just did. That's why the front page of the Daily Mail is calling about a diaspora in D.C. I'm not unsympathetic to the notion that some people may have difficulty paying. And so creating flexibility within the bureaucracy that allows for hardship exemptions or reductions administratively, that seems to me something I would support that.
Okay, so I think we've plumbed the depths of that.
So,
Sorry, I'm sorry.
yeah, first of all, in terms of equity, I believe there's data that shows that low-income families, especially in Ward 7 and 8, are unduly affected by traffic fatalities, and especially pedestrian. But on a more general basis, this is a fine and a fee, and we're a tax commission. So there's also fines and fees to apply for a permit. There's also fees that rec centers charge for certain classes. So are we going to comment on all of those? I know that this was raised, instituted in the budget partially to raise revenue to balance the budget, but it's a slippery slope for us to even be talking about this. This is to me more social policy. And if I, to Tony's point or somebody's point earlier about if I were the mother whose child had been run over by a speeding driver, I would react negatively to this. And I think that press coverage for this summer did show that the worst offenders are the repeat offenders. And there are people who have been involved in these horrific accidents of unsafe driving were repeat offenders, which gets back to, well, why weren't their licenses revoked? Why wasn't their car booted? Why weren't they arrested? So it just, to me, sends a wrong signal to dial some of this back, which is separate from having a payment plan or a delinquent plan. But again, I don't understand why we as a tax commission would get into fees. There are a lot of other fees and fines in the government that we could get into. And
I appreciate that comment, Gregory, because I'm struggling with this one in part because, you know, changes contemplated here can have a huge financial effect that I think you can't separate from sort of the conversation about the objective we're trying to achieve in terms of sort of the cost burden. Because the practical matter is there's a lot of money that flows to the district's general fund based on these fines and fees. And I think if we were to consider this, I mean, I would be asking a ton of questions about what the sort of efficacy of this is, who pays at what, what percentage of people pay from DC versus Maryland, how this fits in the context of Vision Zero and traffic safety. There's a lot of, I think, administrative and operational things that are tied behind this fee that are important to consider before we start tinkering with the fee. That I think you can't separate, and that is a matter of, that's not tax policy, that's, this is a fee and fine category that has a whole operational apparatus and strategy behind it that needs to be rightfully considered if we start to do something dramatic here.
I mean, I guess I'm supportive of all three proposals. I think there's conversation we could have about what the actual proposal looks like. But I think these are good starting points for a discussion. I think the reason to consider, I mean, it's not a tax, but it is big enough and levied enough that it is a major source of revenue for the district, and now one that doesn't just go to Vision Zero, but actually these are dollars flowing into our general fund. It's highly regressive, and we have big impacts on folks with low incomes. I think the way that we increase double fees, double the fines, and then people get the surcharges and get stuck in kind of a cycle of being indebted that they can't get out of because they couldn't afford probably the initial ticket is problematic. And I think that we should generally, with our tax code, try to shift from a system that is taking more from folks with lower incomes and focusing on how do we structure a tax system that's based on ability to pay. And I think that this is like the exact opposite of that, with totally racialized outcomes because of other racial inequities here in the district that are so deep and long-standing. I think whether it's a 50% reduction in the traffic fine amount or something else, could be up for discussion, but it feels like a shift that we should be making.
But it's worth noting, I mean, you said, I think, I don't have the words in your mouth, that the data is at best ambivalent about whether these fees do promote safety. So if that's the case, that was the mayor's premise for this, was exactly the opposite. So something has to be married there in terms of, you can say whether it is or not, but
having lots of cameras and issuing lots of tickets, that does promote safety. It's having these big dollar amounts associated with each ticket that seems not. And I'm probably bastardizing the research.
That's maybe a function of who we collect from as well, right? I mean, there's one aspect here, you talk about visitor friendliness. Unless you're a regular commuter to DC or a DC resident, you have no reason to pay for these tickets. And there's the collection agency that cannot sell this debt for cents on the dollar. We're not able to collect from visitors. So I don't think that's an issue at all. The issue is, if we're going to approach this, it's in the context of helping the really low-income residents, then I would rather see an approach where there's a payment plan or something like this, as opposed to a across-the-board reduction, because we are hooked onto this revenue. It's your point, right? It's $150 million. If we cut half of it, we're gonna have to find $75 million elsewhere. I'm not sure it's the best way to like.
But are we the right body to be tackling this, I think is a broader question.
Well,
And I served on the board of DC Public Library, the building we're in. We actually abolished all library fines years ago, and we did look at data that said the fines were unduly weighed in wards 7 and 8. And we came to the conclusion is that if there's a boy or a girl hoarding books in their house, we're kind of okay with that. Yeah. But that was something that I think more appropriately done by the library board than the tax commission.
Right, but we are the group that can decide, like, actually, we should reduce our reliance on fees and fines and raise other taxes that we think are more progressive, like meet our other principles to make up for it.
That,
Okay, I think we've got all the views of everyone very well stated. We'll revisit this like the other ones.
Yes.
This is a classic example where fees are economically efficient and socially regressive. I mean, they're efficient at that they get exactly at who should be paying, and they don't. In terms of equity, right, and they don't pay. Right.
In terms of other, I would also just note there is a mayor's task force that's looking at ATV, and their preliminary report is supposed to come out in a couple of weeks. So that would help shape how we go forward.
And if we want our legitimacy questioned, this is a good way to say, yeah, get rid of your 200 million, yeah. Okay, what are your other recommendations?
We'll turn around and raise it right back up.
Which doesn't mean it isn't right, but I'm just, okay.
All right, last two are in the sort of the miscellaneous category because they're not about actually changing a tax, they are about changing the system around taxation. So one is around the DC taxpayer advocate. A couple of years ago, DC created an Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. This was created administratively. There wasn't a statute passed, there was a proposal in council. But in the wake of that, OTR, by its own volition, created an Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. It's about a staff of about 7. A lot of what it does is it helps individuals with their tax issues. But I think part of the vision of offices of taxpayer advocates, both at the IRS and in other states, is a little bit larger in that it's intended to be a voice for systematic change in how taxes are administered, and even the advocate statutory changes that can make OTR more taxpayer friendly. So a number of our commenters submitted suggestions on ways to strengthen the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. I've augmented this by going and looking at some of the powers that IRS's Taxpayer Advocate and other states have. So we've got 7 ideas here that essentially go at making the Taxpayer Advocate a little more independent, a little more transparent in terms of actually submitting an annual public report to the mayor and the council, giving the Taxpayer Advocate power that it has at the federal level and in other states to actually waive a certain amount of penalties and fees if they're attributed to OTR error, and potentially creating an independent board, an advisory board that could provide an outside set of spectacles on OTR and its operations. The arguments against it is that things are working fine, that Taxpayer Advocate has been created, it does exist, and giving it more independence would actually undermine its relationship with OTR and its ability to actually get things done.
I think these are great suggestions. I support them across the board, honestly. Just a quick illustration, just anecdote. We have this very expensive vacant property tax where you're taxed essentially at $5 per 100 or whatever. Very frequently, the district won't get around to approving your building permits for years while you are taxed at this vacant property rate. And so when we talk about affordable housing issues, when you can't know with certainty from the moment you start a project that you will get a building permit to begin construction, and I know of an entity that's got 6 figures in taxes owed because they've waited for the building permits to come from the government. So the government, it's kind of an interesting way. The government can gouge you at 5 times the rate while they sit on your building permit. And there's no one to go to. So I love this idea. And I really like the independent board.
Well, I was the first CFO, and we created the created a very powerful office, which I think has served the district well, but I think more transparency and accountability, particularly around execution of business taxes, particularly commercial real property, which is now in the gutter, because of the economic conditions, I think is good. And having a board that looks at what the CFO does, the way boards look at the way the rest of the executive government does, how can that be bad? And I would say this for the CFO here.
It's not an indictment or
No.
a reflection poorly on him at all. It's just the nature of the beast.
And, we've talked a lot about the opportunity for administrative reforms that the CFO can pursue and do. To have an entity that is focused on that, that's independent, that has a board that can sort of push that entity to do that, I think is all to the good.
So in the normal process of stuff, would a taxpayer go to the regular number at OCFO and then reach an impasse or just disagree, and then they would go here, or are they prevented from going?
I have to ask you, the agency, XYZ, and you say, get out of here, and then I go to the advocate. I can't, before I even talk to you, say, oh, they're inefficient, they're a joke. I want to talk to you first, right?
I'm curious, though, on most of the times when the advocate advocates, is it because of a blatant error that someone else made, or is it because there was an issue that was really hard and could have come down either way, and it was hard and they just went the other way and I'm appealing it? Or is it error, or is it interpretation that they're ruling on most of the time?
Well, that's a big question because we also discussed this. There are problems of execution, which is clearly, the taxpayer advocate provides accountability. Then there are questions of judgment,
Right,
which is a different question, because then you already have remedies for disagreements on judgment.
Yeah.
So that's a big question for this.
So ultimately, you go to court, you go
Right,
to
right.
administrative judge, you go to RIPTAC, whatever they're called right now.
This is more like David's point. You're exacting me on one regime when you're actually creating another, And I'm paying for your tardiness in exacting the new regime.
What does everybody think about the nature of this being an independent body? What do people think?
Oh, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, me too.
So independent outside the OCFO? So something akin to like an
I think it'd be
ombudsman
easier
almost.
legally to get the CFO to agree because you have issues of independence of the CFO.
Okay.
So the argument is that right now the taxpayer advocate plays well with the CFO because they are not independent. But the counter argument is if the advocate is independent, then when they are making recommendations, which are not binding, CFO can say, I'm not going to do any of this. But the CFO cannot change or water down these recommendations because they're independent. I think that's where it plays the biggest role. The relationship between the advocates and OTR is not going to change that much at the beginning, in my opinion. But in the long run, they could have more impact.
Our last proposal comes from the Chamber of Commerce. It goes a little beyond tax legislation. I mean, I've described this as being specifically about tax legislation. They actually like to see it on all legislation. There's a requirement that there be a economic and small business impact statement for all tax-related legislation. Right now, the DC Budget Office can do it and does do it, as I understand it, for most major pieces of legislation, but this would actually require it. Some other states require similar analyses. Maryland has fiscal and policy notes for all legislative proposals that include a small business impact statement. The argument is not our fiscal impact statements are binding, right? You can't, when the CFO's office puts out a fiscal statement, that constrains what the council can do. These would essentially be informative. So similar to the racial equity notes that the council office for racial equity does, similar to the analyses that the CFO's office does on tax abatements, or the information is provided to the council. The council is not required to do anything in particular in response to it. This could obviously does not have an immediate revenue impact, but it could require some substantial staffing in whatever, if this is.
I think the CFO, myself, or somebody should provide economic analysis on both the equity front and the efficiency front for all legislation and regulation. But since that's not going to happen tomorrow night, I think a good place to start is tax legislation. But I would say both sides of it. If it's regressive, that should be called out. And if there is a cost associated with it economically, that should be called out on an advisory basis.
I agree. I'd put it in the CFO's office rather than the council office. Obviously, while the council budget office has historically been very professional, there are obvious pressures that can be placed on the council budget office that may not be placed on a CFO analysis. We could hope that there could be real institutional business knowledge within the CFO's office in a way that sometimes we don't have that consistent subject matter expertise in council staff, and we could professionalize it just so folks who can know this is it. But it's not like we have to square accounts like the numbers. We understand that. But it helps inform the members, and I don't think there's any reason for them to be opposed to having information.
Another reason to put it in ORA is because they have access to tax data, whereas the council budget office doesn't.
I think this sounds like a fine idea, but one question I have is, would it be just on like the bottom line, the P&L of businesses, or would it look in the out years about competitiveness as well, and what it's going to be doing in the long term, like a tax? So is this just
In my dream,
how much
it
forecasting
would talk
does it do?
about the broader economic impacts, not just the budget impacts of the district. If you thought it had broader, like if you were doing the traffic fines and this capacity existed, you would say, one of the effects here is that for people in lower incomes, they're going to be paying disproportionately more because this is a fee in the way they work. They're going to be paying disproportionately more. If there were anti-competitive effects, you would point that out. And I think you ought to be pointing it out. You ought to think twice before you pass taxes, do regulations.
I mean, I think that,
Go ahead.
okay, yeah. I mean, I think that's a little, that's a distributional analysis, like who gets impacted by the tax, but not necessarily what the impact on the economy is. And I think that those kinds of analyses are notoriously really difficult to do, and how good they are depends on what assumptions you're making and what kinds of ideas you're putting into these black box modeling programs that people have. I mean, I just think
But the best states do it. And over time, people on different sides work at it and get it better and better. I mean, I think the issues you point out are legitimate issues, but it's not a reason not to start creating and refining a process.
It doesn't serve as a veto on the legislation. It's just a data point for people to consider.
That's true, right?
And I mean, if we wanted to narrow it initially and grow over time, you could start with changes to the tax code, and any time a legislation permits rulemaking, because that's going to trigger unintended or intended or unintended costs. So that's a way so just because you put a new swing set out doesn't necessarily mean you have to do a business analysis. But when you're changing taxes or permitting regulation, that's worthy of a few sentences about this could happen or be aware of this. The 13 members, it's not a Jedi council. I'm sorry, it just isn't. And they have limited experiences and limited, as you would expect. We don't have a 200-member legislature with various experiences to bring to the table. We have 13. What could harm having additional information?
No, I mean, I think we do have a need for more kind of independent analysts working on our budget and policy decisions. I don't disagree with that. I think this particular kind of like dynamic scoring is notoriously difficult, not particularly good out there. I think that also when you're talking about, it's hard to like say, we're gonna just look at tax and not other things, because actually when you raise or cut taxes, you have impacts on spending, and the spending might have different kinds of impacts on the economy. I mean, I just don't think it's as simple as saying like, we're gonna slice off a little piece and take a look at it. There's, you know, all kinds of potential impacts and effects that go beyond the tax.
Here's another way to think about it. So as we are working.
To me,
Go ahead.
To me, though, because we're a deep blue state, we're not like Texas, where if you do some analysis, someone's going to jump up, and before you know it, the budget for X, Y, and Z legitimate human service need is going to be halved. No, here it's just going to be hopefully done better. You see what I'm saying? I don't know. I mean, where I come from, you're fighting for efficiency and a strong economy, so you can do the things we want to do better and help more people.
The way I think about this is we as the commission have certain North Stars, right? It's the competitiveness, efficiency, blah, 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 all of that stuff, that racial equity, that's a new focus. We're basically commanding here that when it comes to tax policy, impact on small business, as this proposal, should be as important as all these other considerations, and the city should know about this. If we are doing that for small business, we should also think about expanding the economy, the impact statements on racial equity, where we're doing it on competitiveness, which we're not doing right now. I think the economic impact analysis is important. It's just like, why are we starting with small businesses? Like, I can understand why with tax, but I don't understand why with small businesses. I think it should be broader. We do have the TAFAs, for example, that the council regularly ignores. So again,
I like that, broadening it.
What's the threshold for small business? Is it number of employees, is it gross receipts, is it profit?
What if we took
all
Yeshim's
three.
idea? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying it could be all three, yeah.
And then
What if we took Yeshim's idea and made it broader to economic competitiveness or business in general? And had that, you know, there may be other things that we would want to include in fiscal impact statements. But we're a work in progress. This government's only 50 years old. We haven't actually perfected all of these processes, and I don't think it would hurt us to be more discerning in how we create data for the members to make their decisions. All right, and the reality is that, again, it's a small body. Not all members go to every hearing. Not all members read all reports. It's a matter of physics, time and space. They can't be every place at once. So creating a professional report that touches on equity and touches on competitiveness, it's just data for them to think about. God forbid we actually start looking at our program's applications. You know, are we actually doing what we say we're going to do with this program? Are there other ways to do it?
I always thought y'all should have spent more on research, but you weren't gonna get me to phone and say, you know. But, you know, when they would sit and argue about the drapes in somebody's office, I was like, keep on arguing, you know, because I mean, yeah, I mean.
Why get in the middle of that
Exactly,
foolishness?
right, yeah.
On that note, we are done for today.
So what collection or suite of proposals will we be talking about next
Yeah,
week?
so next week is, I think it's gonna be mostly business proposals. We will be talking about the business activity tax idea that came up a while back. And some other business tax ideas. We've got some more fees and fines ideas.
New Hampshire is the biggest example of business activity tax.
Right,
And the nonprofits in New Hampshire, do they pay that or not?
no.
Like Dartmouth and University of New Hampshire, no?
So we will talk about that, and then we will, fees and fines, and maybe a few others, and then the following, and then we're still working on getting more revenue statements, revenue estimates in for a bunch of the income tax and property tax statements, so that'll determine how those will work. So I think it's next Tuesday we get together again, and we will have
It's the same time
Yep,
and
back
same
here, I
place?
believe, right back in the same room.
Same
Um,
time?
Right now, we are not planning to get you all hard copies unless you want it. We will email those out and you all can print them yourselves and put them in your
Right, that'd be
binders. If
great,
that's okay,
yes.
if anyone needs hard copies, we can arrange for that.
Is it in the same
Yeah,
conference
same
room?
room, same
Yeah.
time.
2 to 4:30.
2 to
2 to
4:30.
4:30.
next
2 to
week.
4:30.
Should be on your calendars.
But if you send it out, I'm sure I have
Good.
it.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Make sure we'll have more tables next time.
This was okay.
Bye, guys.
It's a good discussion. I was